Prime Minister Mark Carney says he's anticipating a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Tuesday's meeting was years in the making. With U.S. tariffs still in place, Canada is looking to China as a way to diversify trading relationships.
Relationships are built and strengthened by people.
But many are calling on Prime Minister Carney to be cautious, including former diplomat Michael Kovrig, who was imprisoned in China for nearly 3 years.
You cannot count on China honoring any agreement you make with it unless it suits the Communist Party to do so.
It was supposed to be a breakthrough moment. For months, Prime Minister Mark Carney had been building up to his long-anticipated meeting with Chinese officials. The hope was simple. If Canada could strike the right deal with Beijing, it might soften the economic blow of Donald Trump's tariffs. Carney went in hoping for a lifeline. What he walked away with instead was a painful reminder of how little leverage Canada really has when it leans too heavily on China. The backdrop to this meeting is years in the making. Canada has been caught in the middle of a tense economic standoff ever since Trump's return to aggressive tariff policies, with new levies looming on key industries, particularly pharmaceuticals, which are worth more than $70 billion to Canada. Carney's government felt the squeeze. Trump's decision to raise H-1B visa fees to $100,000 per applicant was already pricing Canadian tech firms out of vital talent pipelines. Faced with mounting pressure, Carney's team looked eastward. Publicly, Carney described his conversations with Beijing as constructive. Privately, the reality was stark. No deals, no concessions, no breakthroughs. What Canada asked for was clear. They wanted China to remove tariffs on Canadian canola. In return, Carney was prepared to relax restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles entering the Canadian market. But critics were quick to point out the risks. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig, who spent nearly 3 years imprisoned in China, warned that trusting Beijing was dangerous. You cannot count on China to honor any agreement unless it suits the Communist Party, he said bluntly. His warning was not abstract. It reflected the hard truth that China plays a long game, planning years ahead, and doesn't hesitate to use economic ties as leverage. Unlike democracies where leadership shifts quickly, China operates on continuity and strategic patience. The danger for Canada was clear. Opening the floodgates to Chinese EVs could hollow out its auto industry and surrender leverage in future trade disputes. Even worse, it could chip away at Canadian sovereignty. Critics argued that this wasn't a calculated trade strategy at all, it was desperation. Carney needed a win, and China knew it. Adding to the unease, China has long been accused of meddling in Canadian politics. Just last year, Canada's spy agency confirmed that Beijing had targeted members of parliament with attempts at electoral interference. Sitting down with a government already under suspicion of undermining Canadian democracy made Carney's choice look even more questionable. At the same time, Trump's economic hammer kept falling. He wasn't just talking tough, he was moving markets overnight. His threats of 100% tariffs on pharmaceuticals weren't empty gestures. They were live weapons in an economic war, and Canada had no comparable tools. While Trump dictated terms, Carney was left scrambling for alternatives, hopping across continents in search of allies. Yet, each trip seemed to reinforce the same image: a leader traveling abroad for photo ops while failing to deliver results back home. When Carney met with European leaders in London, including the prime ministers of Spain, Iceland, and Australia, nothing concrete came out of it, not even the long-negotiated Canada-UK free trade deal. Instead of headlines about progress, Canadians saw their prime minister in endless meetings that produced little more than handshakes and carefully staged photos. The political backlash inside Canada was swift. Conservatives accused Carney of neglecting domestic crisis, spiraling debt, rising crime, job losses, and immigration pressures while chasing symbolic victories abroad. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre called Carney's travel liberal show business, a distraction from Canada's mounting problems. And to many Canadians, the criticism stuck. Carney tried to flip Trump's policies into an opportunity. If the U.S. was making it harder for foreign workers to enter with expensive visas, Canada could present itself as the more welcoming alternative. On paper, it sounded clever. But at home, the reality was very different. Canadian cities cities were already straining under housing shortages, rising costs, and declining public support for high levels of immigration. Promising to bring in even more workers felt out of touch with what many Canadians were experiencing on the ground. This is the contrast that defined Carney's China gamble. Trump didn't need meetings or photo ops to dominate the agendas. Decisions had immediate, tangible consequences. Carney, on the other hand, was constantly reacting, flying across the world for dialogue that yielded nothing. In politics, perception matters, and the optics painted Carney as weak and desperate. The larger issue wasn't just trade or tariffs, it was sovereignty. Who sets the rules in North America? Who defends domestic industries? Who shields democracy from foreign interference? Trump, whether in office or not, still dictated the economic weather across the continent. Canada was left trying to adjust to his storm, and Carney's attempt to find shelter in Beijing only made him look smaller. The lesson was clear. Leaning on China isn't strength, it's a sign of desperation. When you turn to Beijing for help, you're not negotiating from a position of power. You're admitting you've run out of options. And that was the painful reality Carney faced. His trip to China didn't secure relief. It didn't protect Canadian jobs. It didn't strengthen Canada's global standing. Instead, it exposed just how vulnerable Canada has become in the age of Trump's economic dominance. When Carney boarded his flight back from Beijing, he didn't come home with new trade deals, tariff relief, or concrete economic protections. What he brought back instead was a stack of photographs, a few polite statements about dialogue, and a flood of criticism waiting for him in Ottawa. The contrast was brutal. On one side of the border, Trump had already reshaped markets with the stroke of a pen. His threats weren't empty. They were backed by executive power and the economic clout of the United States. On the other side, Carney had traveled halfway around the world, only to return with little more than diplomatic pleasantries. The optics couldn't have been worse. At home, Canadians were feeling squeezed. Inflation was driving up costs on everything from groceries to housing. Families were struggling to keep up with rising debt. Hospitals and schools were buckling under pressure. Strikes were hitting key industries, and public frustration was growing. Against that backdrop, seeing their prime minister in a string of overseas meetings with Tune no wins to show for, it looked tone-deaf. Conservatives wasted no time hammering the point. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre blasted Carney's foreign trips as distractions, accusing him of ignoring problems at home. His message was simple but effective. Carney was out of touch with ordinary Canadians, more interested in global photo ops than in tackling crime, job losses, or the crushing cost of living. The narrative stuck because it tapped into real frustrations people were already feeling. Even Carney's attempt to frame Trump's immigration clampdown as a Canadian opportunity backfired. The idea was that if the U.S. was pricing out skilled workers with massive visa fees, Canada could swoop in and attract that talent. In theory, it made sense. But in reality, Canadian cities were already straining under housing shortages and soaring rents. Public services were stretched thin. Promising to bring in more foreign workers sounded clever on paper, but it rang hollow to citizens who felt the system was already at a breaking point. Meanwhile, Trump's policies kept rewriting the rules of the game. By threatening tariffs of 100% on pharmaceuticals, he put one of Canada's most valuable industries at risk overnight. By raising visa fees, he forced Canadian tech firms into a scramble for talent. Trump didn't need to attend international summits or pose for cameras. His policies alone dictated the economic climate. This imbalance made Carney look reactive instead of proactive. Every move Trump made forced Canada to respond. Carney's trip to Beijing was one more attempt to find breathing space, but instead, it highlighted how little room Canada had to maneuver. Leaning on China wasn't a bold strategy. It was a desperate gamble, and Beijing knew it. Worse, the risk wasn't just economic hit, was political and strategic. China had already been accused of election interference in Canada, with reports confirming that Canadian MPs were targeted by Beijing's operations. Sitting down with Chinese officials under those circumstances didn't project strength. It made Carney look like he was negotiating with a government actively undermining Canadian democracy. That image was devastating. The fallout reached beyond partisan politics. Canadians who might not follow the details of trade policy could still see the pattern. Endless travel, endless meetings, but no tangible progress. The perception was that Carney was more focused on looking like a global statesman than on fixing problems at home. And in politics, perception often matters more than reality. This is where the larger battle comes into focus. Carney had long envisioned Canada as a global broker, a middle power that could help bridge divides between East and West. In theory, that vision had appeal. A Canada that shaped outcomes instead of merely reacting sounded like a country stepping into a bigger role on the world stage. But reality told a different story. Trump's vision for North America was blunt. The United States sets the rules, and everyone else keeps up or gets left behind. Carney wanted Canada to be at the table shaping global outcomes. But in practice, he was left waiting to see what Trump did next. His attempt to balance relationships with China, Europe, and the US didn't result in influence. It resulted in Canada looking like it was being pulled in all directions. That's the painful truth of the situation. For Canada, the stakes weren't just about tariffs or trade flows. They were about sovereignty. Who decides the economic direction of North America? Who protects domestic industries from collapse? Who ensures that democracy isn't compromised by foreign powers? For now, the answers weren't coming from Ottawa. Carney wanted his trip to China to show leadership. Instead, it underscored how much Canada depends on the decisions of others. When you beg Beijing for relief, you don't look like a global leader. You look like a politician running out of options. And that's exactly how Carney appeared. Trump, whether you love him or hate him, knows how to wield power. He doesn't just play the optics game. He controls the levers of policy that shape entire industries overnight. That's why, even out of office, his presence looms so large. He dictates the economic weather, and Canada has no choice but to adjust to the storm. Carney, by contrast, was stuck trying to manage appearances. More trips, more meetings, more handshakes. But every time he failed to secure real results, the gap between perception and reality grew wider. In politics, that gap can be fatal. Canadians saw a leader chasing photo ops abroad while their own struggles at home deepened. The lesson from this episode is harsh but unavoidable. Canada cannot lean on China without risking its sovereignty. It cannot rely on endless diplomacy without securing real wins. And it cannot afford a prime minister who looks like he's reacting to events rather than shaping them. Carney's China gamble was supposed to be a strategic move. Instead, it exposed weakness. It showed a leader boxed in by Trump's dominance, scrambling for options, and willing to risk Canada's auto industry and political independence for the faint hope of tariff relief. The trip didn't project strength. It projected desperation. And in the unforgiving world of global politics, desperation is the worst look of all. Beijing saw it. Trump saw it. And, most importantly, Canadians saw it too. In the end, Carney's trip to China will not be remembered as a diplomatic breakthrough. It will be remembered as the moment when Canada's vulnerability was laid bare, when its prime minister came back empty-handed, and when the contrast between Trump's dominance and Carney's weakness could no longer be ignored. Canada wanted to show it could stand tall on the global stage. Instead, the world saw a country leaning too heavily on others, struggling to find its footing, and discovering that in the age of Trump, even long-anticipated meetings in Beijing can end in failure.